It's always an honor to talk about my favorite subject. This will be a little different than anything else you will hear because it is both a bit of history, it is something of a review, it's something of an essay, and it has a little commercial aspect in it too. So what I'm going to do is give you the shortened version of some talks and seminars I do related to this subject, and hope that I won't skip too many things, and if you want me to slow down on something and talk more about it, I'll be delighted. So, before we get into it too deep, this photo is of the Tibetan women's soccer team, and I won't mention them again till the end. I just want you to put their picture in your mind as we get deeper into this. You probably know most of this. As I talk to younger folks, that's not always the case. But the spirituals, that extraordinary combination of African music and what essentially is a version of first century Christianity, was the only avenue of creativity allowed to the slaves before the Civil War. Everything else was taken away from them. And some things are not only taken away, but even possession of writing materials was punishable by death. There are some cases where the people who taught the slaves how to read and write were punished by death. Ownership of a map, no matter how crude, would mean your entire house would be put to death. Even shoes were forbidden. They took everything else away, all of the different creative arts, except for singing. And the slaves convinced their new owners that if you just let us sing, we'll work better. And in this one little area, they created an entire civilization. They created and reproduced many of the things from the nations they had had in Africa before they came. Because you got to remember, right up until the 1800s, some of the nations in Africa where the slaves were taken from were far advanced than comparable cities in Western Europe. And the Yoruba had running water, toilets. They had a postal system. They had a light system. They had standing armies. They had cavalries. They had a written language that unfortunately very little of it survives. When the one thing that was left to them, the spirituals, they were able to use to teach to read and write, to count, to do religion. They were able to take the spirituals to do a whole creative form that was forbidden to them in any other way. They used them for therapy. They used them to get all riled up when that was needed. And of course, they used the spirituals for religious purposes. For a long time, we only thought that the spirituals were exactly what they said. These are religious songs about Jesus and about heaven. But in about the 1940s, early 50s, there began a movement of people talking to surviving slaves or going through the slave records and finding out that maybe there's more to it. The term that Lewis Gates gives to it is double voicedness. And it's part of a long tradition in Africa of words mean one thing to one group, but an entirely something else to another. And as the researchers continue right up until today, more and more of the about 6,000 spirituals that we know of have this double voicedness. That they're actually, while their slaveholders were thinking they were just singing about heaven, they were actually singing about the Ohio River. That they were singing about how to get free, and not just how to get free. Some of them, like Follow the Drinking Gourd, are actual road maps. And the lyrics of Follow the Drinking Gourd, which were not even deciphered to the 1920s by a Texas historian, are actual sites along the way from the Tombigbee River in Alabama to Louisville and beyond. Specific places they could go. And the drinking gourd, in a time when you could not own maps, the drinking gourd was the North Star. Follow the drinking gourd, follow the North Star. As long as you're following that, you may have a chance to get to freedom and heaven. Many of these songs that seem so innocuous, like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, are actually heavily identified with the Underground Railroad. I spoke this summer in Nantucket And there are still traditions among the former slaves' families, some of whom were freed by the whaling ships, where different songs are sung, and they still knew the meanings to some of these. And that wade in the water was actually a message to the slaves: if you're being followed by the dogs of the patrollers, go to the creeks and streams where they can't follow your scent. Steal away to Jesus was a particular one set of plantations. It was said when there were people coming like a Harriet Tubman to lead you to freedom, steal away was the signal to meet at a certain place at a certain time and go from there. So, yes, of the 6,000, how many of them were protest spirituals? We don't know. Maybe all, maybe a percentage. They're still beautiful and wonderful and religious in their own right. It just makes them richer, not different, to have all of these things there. And a few of them, if the Lord can deliver Daniel, why not any man, strikes me as being particularly bold. To sing that in front of somebody who has your life in their hands, why not any man? Why not me? And yet, there are virtually no references, and again, they're spotty, of slaves being punished for singing one of these songs. Now, that actually comes later in Reconstruction. Former slaves are beaten for some of this, but not during the antebellum times and stuff. What's remarkable about the slaves' songs, these spirituals, is how much in very simple words could be conveyed. One of the most moving movies I've seen in a long time, 12 Years a Slave, which, as you probably know, about a free black man who is later enslaved and has to re-earn his freedom once again. And an extraordinary performance by the lead actor encapsulates in the singing of Roll, Jordan, Roll, this transition from hopelessness and despair of the early slaves to anger to resolution. And in the course of just a 4-minute. Perhaps you remember this scene.
Went down to the river Jordan, where John baptized 3. Where I walked the devil to hell, said Johnny baptized me. I said, go, Jordan, go, go, Jordan, go. My soul will rise, heaven, Lord, with you. Well, some say John was a Baptist. Some say John was a Jew, but I say John was a preacher, cause my Bible says so. I say, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll. Hallelujah, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll. Hallelujah, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll. Everybody say, roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll. Roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll. Hallelujah. Roll, Jordan, roll, roll, Jordan, roll. My soul will rise in heaven, Lord, for you and Jordan, roll.
I play this clip because part of my research the last 15 years has been taking me to black churches, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds, as I've been working on this topic. Let me tell you, when they sing the spirituals in black churches, they don't sing them like they do here. This is not go tell it on the mountain like some child song. These songs have a depth and a resonance that go beyond the mere singing. And even people too young to know what I'm talking about in the black churches and the conferences where I go to have some kind of deeper connection to this. And it's part of what began to strike me as I began my work on the history of gospel music. Now, the rest of this you probably know that as the Civil War and Reconstruction give away, there were people who thought the spirituals would die, and perhaps they were certainly not at the same level of prominence as they were before. But when Reconstruction rolls around and the lives of black men and women become even less than they were as slaves, there's a resurgence, particularly in the South, of the singing of the spirituals. Even though every 10 years or so the big white magazines would bemoan the fact that the spirituals are gone and dying, they just hadn't gone far enough down the road or on the other side of the tracks. They were still there. And in a culture that made sure so many blacks couldn't read or write, it's tough to sing the old hymns when you don't have the lyrics. The spirituals are created in such a way, particularly with the call and the response, that you didn't need the songbooks to make it. The Great Migration begins in the 1890s and continued through World War I and beyond, which takes millions and millions of African Americans out of some of the worst conditions on the planet into the great urban centers of the North and West. They take the spirituals, which by now have morphed into what we call Jubilee. Jubilee is the old spirituals, but arranged. The tenor, alto, soprano, bass. Sounds kind of like they sang. We don't know what the old spirituals sang. We don't have any recordings. We have some things from Gee's Bend, Alabama, and some deep churches in the Mississippi that are still singing them in the same way, we think. But this Jubilee continues this tradition. The Fifth Jubilee singers, Paul Robeson and others, continued to sing the lyrics with the melody lines. It just never sounded like a gospel glee choir at a military academy. It's when you add the beat of Saturday night to the spirituals and the Jubilee of Sunday morning, you get what we call gospel music in the late 1920s and 1930s, beginning in Chicago, but several other places. It was beginning to be written in that way under Thomas Dorsey. Gospel music, by the way, and part of my current research is finding out a lot of gospel songs, which we thought, again, were just praise songs, just songs about Jesus. It turns out beginning in the 1950s. So many of these gospel songs had a second message for those people who knew. Even Mahalia Jackson's Moving On Up was widely understood in the black community as being a protest song, as being a song against the established order of America in that time. If we had more time, I would talk about the 1930s and 40s when African Americans are finally allowed in the unions. It's shameful it took so long, but at least the unions, unlike a lot of America, did take African Americans. And an extraordinary thing happens where the labor unions, which had a nearly 200-year tradition of singing labor songs, start melting and merging with the spirituals and the protest spirituals and create something new altogether. And this ends up being important in Montgomery, Alabama, just a few years later. Put songs like In That Great Getting Up Morning, one of the oldest spirituals, becomes In That Great Revolutionary Morning. And from labor movement, some of the songs like a tree planted beside the water, We Shall Not Be Moved, is actually a labor song that the civil rights movement takes. And Which Side Are You On, Boy, which was sung a lot in Selma, again, comes from the labor movement into the civil rights movement from it. What I have here is the same song done originally how it was sung in labor unions by Pete Seeger with a banjo, done by Mississippi John Hurt, and then how it was sung in Birmingham. And you can see the evolution that goes on. They get slower with a heavier beat. Again, if we had more time, we'd talk about the Highlander schools, 8 different colleges around the country that turned out to be very significant places. They originally taught to help the migrant farmers and farm workers to read and write, to plant better, and to learn how to register to vote. But what they also became, something where songs were disseminated. And Pete Seeger, again, was one of those, the Carawans and others who came there, began hearing the songs in different places, would bring them together at Highlander, and when other groups would come, would teach them to take back to their homes. This is an extraordinary photo here. Martin Luther King, Pete Seeger, Rosa Parks, and Abernathy, King's lieutenant. They are at Highlander. And they heard a song that had just been introduced by tobacco pickers from North Carolina. And they teach it. The Carawans teach it to King and Parks and Abernathy. And on the drive back to Montgomery, King is sitting in the back seat and he taps him on the shoulder, according to Abernathy's biography, and says, You know that song we heard today, that We Shall Overcome song? That's really catchy, isn't it? We ought to sing that again. And in fact,
Where was the Highlander school?
they were from the 1930s. Highlander itself is the last one to be closed in
Where
the
were they?
1950s.
Where?
Knoxville, Tennessee, Minneapolis, I get my list, but they're scattered around the country. The one in Wisconsin lasts nearly as long as Highlander. Under the Red Scare, they being closed down because some of the former people who worked there had worked in the labor movement and were communists. And in places like Tennessee, they were
They must have been in the South too, because you mentioned them going back.
Yeah, that particular one is Mount Eagle, Tennessee, where that particular photo is.
Right.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Not in
Yeah,
Alleluia.
that's right outside of Mount Eagle. It moves to Knoxville after they're closed down shortly after this photo. But it's still there. They are still much smaller, but they are still doing the same things, teaching farmers, crop veterans to take care of their rights. The Montgomery bus boycott, which brings together a charismatic young preacher, a group of people in Montgomery who have labor backgrounds, including Mr. Nixon, who had been working for the labor unions as part of the porters, and others, and a number of people with singing backgrounds, including Bayard Rustin, who actually had recorded for the Library of Congress both spirituals before moving into the labor movement. They create the first successful large-scale protest movement in this country. And what the existing literature doesn't do is say how much of the time they spent in singing. And some of the songs that have become famous later begin here in Montgomery. In the early days, it's more leaning on the everlasting arms, some of the old hymns, a lot of Fanny Crosby, a lot of Isaac Watts, but the protest songs will come shortly and are introduced there. Again, if you were my students, I would have to explain a lot of the civil rights movement and the music of it and why it matters and how all of this becomes something called freedom songs, taking the old protest spirituals, sometimes taking rhythm and blues songs, sometimes taking labor union songs, and using them for a variety of purposes. I found 8 different ways that the freedom songs were used. And it runs parallel with how the spirituals were used. To lift them up when they were beaten and battered, to get them angry when they needed to be angry, to pass on covert messages in front of the people who are hearing them. There's some wonderful stories of the DJs in Birmingham who at certain times would play certain gospel songs which would give the protesters the cue to go downtown, to leave the 16th Street Baptist Church, or whatever. Some of those DJs are still alive. One of them I talked to had been at the same station for 53 years and remembered the songs he played during those very heady months in Birmingham. I don't know that we have time to play much of these, but you know these songs. We shall overcome, ain't nobody gonna turn me around.
Oh,
this one.
freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
And that takes us on to Memphis, and you know the stories of what happened in Memphis. One thing you might be curious, as I was doing the research on the book, King is on the balcony getting ready to leave for dinner. And just before he leaves that fateful evening, Ben Branch shows up. Ben is a musician from Chicago who had been working with him during the Chicago movement. And he is going to play the music while King talks that night at the Masonic Hall. And King is a noted joker. Says, Ben, my friend, I'm glad to see you. Glad you could make it. He's actually been held up by a freak snowstorm of all things. And Branch says, hey, Doc, good to see you. We'll be there tonight. And King says, listen to me. Hear me. I need you to play We Shall Overcome better than you, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, better than you've ever played it before. And Branch says, yeah, you bet, Doc. We'll do good. I promise. We'll get all the notes. And King says, no, you're not hearing me. I need you to play this the best you've ever played it. And Branch said he's taken aback. There's one interview with Branch that was done just days after the shooting. It says, sorry, you bet. You bet. I promise. We'll give you everything we got. And King says, remember. And Jesse Jackson says, you want your coat. And King turns to get the coat. And then, that's his last words are on a gospel song. It mattered that much. These are the kind of things as we begin, as I undertook what we've become, People Get Ready, a new history of black gospel music. And in the course of researching it, why an old fat white guy like me is telling you about the spirituals and protest spirituals is, this is part and parcel of the history of gospel music. You start there. Gospel music being the foundation of all American popular music, that is spirituals. But something interesting happened. While I was doing the research, I would talk about a song that influenced everybody. It was one of the most important gospel songs of all time. I couldn't find a copy. eBay, Amazon, could not find a copy anywhere. And I got angry. And being an old journalist, my response to getting angry is, I sat down and wrote an editorial, and in my arrogance sent it to the New York by God Times, which gets 850 unsolicited editorials a week. And they ran it on Valentine's Day, 2005. And it said, if we allow this music, the foundational music of all popular music, to disappear, future generations are going to deal with us very harshly. It'll be a sin, probably the last time the New York Times used the word sin, to my knowledge. And this music that tells a story that can't be told any other way is disappearing, the golden age of gospel music. 75% of that vinyl is lost, unavailable. So it ran that morning. A gentleman from New York, Mr. Charles Royce, called and said, you figure out how to save it, and I'll pay for it. And that's what he did. That was the beginning of the Black Gospel Music Restoration Project here at Baylor, which is now the largest initiative in the world to identify, acquire, digitize, catalog, and scan gospel music from 1945 to about 1975, the golden age of gospel music, which, by the way, runs with the period of the greatest impact of the African American church and the civil rights movement. I don't think that's a coincidence. And now we have something in the neighborhood of 11,000 songs digitized. We have a larger collection than the Library of Congress, and it's where scholars come to find this music because it's not there anywhere else. Very early on, as the music came in, and we were very fortunate that people like Terry Gross and Fresh Air and the New York Times and others were interested, again, that a fat white guy in Waco, Texas was trying to save this music, that we got a lot of coverage, and when that happened, collectors came to us and said, you can digitize my collection. People went up in the attic, found grandma's vinyl and sent it to us. We'll pay for the shipping, we'll pay for the insurance, and send it back to them. I don't want to hold their vinyl, I just want to harvest the music. And we noticed something on 45s. Now, again, if I'm talking to students, I take one of these out and show them what I'm talking about, because that's a totally alien language to them. That there is an A side and a B side. And my students just don't want to talk about. The A side's the hit side. Talk to the young man. The B side is a side that would be like the only for true fans, only for people that would play, because it would be a throwaway song in a lot of cases. Well, we began, and in the first year, we received more than 60 songs on the B sides by artists both small and large that were civil rights related. I mean, very aggressively civil rights related. Ain't no segregation in heaven type songs. I believe Martin Luther King is right type songs. Or this one of the first ones we received, I'll just play a minute or two of it, by the otherwise unknown Friendly Four, which is a lot of what we have. Where is Freedom, which is actually a shout out to many of the heroes of the civil rights movement, recorded in 1967. at a time when doing that sort of thing in Birmingham was not a good idea to be heard playing this.
Here's a freedom song for all you freedom fighters out there everywhere. And when you sing, remember the wonderful ones who lost their dedicated lives for this precious purpose and won't be around to see it through. Now sing, sing, every one of you.
Well, sometime I wonder, freedom in this world. Sometime I wonder, freedom in this world. Sometime I wonder, freedom in this world. Tell me where, tell me where, tell me where. I wanna know. Well, trouble in Atlanta and in Tennessee, coast of Alabama, walk to the free, Washington, Savannah, and in Baltimore, being in Louisiana, tell me he's got soul. Tell me where, tell me where, tell me where. I wanna know. Well, down in Mississippi.
So my guitar playing friends, that song gives them fits. It's got a strange progression there that they're trying to figure out. From that disc, and more have since come in, I got the idea that maybe it was time to chronicle this music from the Civil Rights War days through the Civil Rights days and beyond. This double voicing, this music that continues to be part and parcel of the African American experience. And that led me to a decade or more on the road and hundreds of interviews talking to the people who were involved in the civil rights movement, how the music was transformative, what they sang, where they sang it, why they sang it, and what happened when they did. And my wife Mary and I went places I never dreamed I'd get to go and talk to people I never experienced, would have ever experienced otherwise. And they told us when they could, and some it was probably too late, about things like singing in the middle of a snowstorm in Nashville, surrounded by a paramilitary group, just ready to bust their heads. And as long as they kept singing, that the group kept its distance. And when after more than 2 hours of nonstop singing, they started faltering, only then did the thugs jump on them and start swinging the bats and the iron pipes. And a number of miraculous things where singing held the monsters at bay. Where singing lifted them up after that terrible night in Selma on the bridge, where standing and lying in their blood in the Brown Cemetery, the funeral home, where somebody started singing, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." It was a 9-year-old girl, blood still wet on her face, and sang, and all that could stand stood again, and they were ready to go again the next morning. How does this music matter? How did this music become something this powerful and transformative? Well, from an academic, that's a scary proposition, because most places don't like you to get into the religious stuff because it's not provable. I don't know that they're anti-religion, but fortunately, being at Baylor, that they allowed me to follow, and I found a wonderful press, Penn State, that thought this was something worth tracing through. Volume 1 ends at the Montgomery bus boycott, which again had much more music than we ever. What do you think they did when they marched 8 miles every day to and from work? They sang. And when we get to Birmingham, and we spend time with all the heroes in the Birmingham Mass Choir and stuff, and I asked them to tell me about the average day during the mass meetings. Say, as soon as we got off work, and if we weren't working, about 3 o'clock, we would go to the designated church. And some nights there were 4 different churches having meetings. There were so many people. Only 10% of all African Americans in churches in Birmingham participated. That was still a lot. And they had to rotate where they were meeting because some of them were getting bombed in what the African Americans call Bombingham. 78 unsolved bombings in the previous 3 years. They would get there about 3 to 5 o'clock and they would sing. Nobody in charge, they would just sing. You needed to get there early to get a good seat. And then around 7 o'clock, somebody would show up and tell them what they needed to do for the next day. I need 100 people to be arrested at 16th Street Baptist Church. I need another 200 to be at Kelly Field. I need another bunch to go downtown at 2 o'clock. And they would give them about 15, 20 minutes of marching orders. Then King or Abernathy or Shuttlesworth would preach, generally 45 minutes to an hour. I wish we had more of those sermons. They would give it sometimes 4 times in the same night, We have a few transcripts, and as you can imagine, with the entire paramilitary forces of Alabama standing outside your church, that you must believe the Holy Spirit's on your side to give some of these fiery sermons, even though they knew that the police were in each meeting and there were turncoats and people, traitors all around. And so on. The police taped them all and destroyed them later. That's the reason we have any at all of them. And then, from about 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, they sang again. And then as they would leave and go out into that Alabama night, with their cars with tires slashed and salt in their gas tanks, with people on horseback, sheriffs, everybody, they sang all the way home. So in the pivotal spear point of African American experience in this country, they're singing 80% of the time. It must be important, or you wouldn't give that much time at this thing when the world's changing. And that's what I tried to find out. What was happening? Why? What was being sung? And that led me from the sit-ins to Resurrection City. And as you know, Resurrection City did not have a good ending. Well, the good ending for us is that the work we were doing got the attention of the new National Museum of African American History and Culture. And they invited us to provide the gospel music for the new museum. And I had the great honor to go the weekend before it opened and to hear the songs we had saved be performed on all these extraordinary new machines and recording devices they had on Donors Night. And I thought it was going to be the donors who had given the big money. It turned out to be the people who had given the artifacts. So my wife and I were the lone white people in a sea of African American heroes from the civil rights movement, from the army, and from the education, and from sports, who had given and stood by the things they gave, and took photos, and cried all night. The bad news was, I was on deadline on this book, and it was ending on a downer. Resurrection City was King's last great adventure, and he died before it could happen. So Abernathy takes it over. And if you remember your history, that was going to be a village for poor people from Mississippi in the middle of the mall in Washington, D.C. And it was going to shame Congress, which still had several major bills yet to pass, particularly one on housing. And without King's strong presence and some of the more militant groups that had already formed back then, that were already parodying the freedom songs, it degenerated into mud and violence and drugs. And finally, the few remaining people there were arrested. And I said, I have spent 11 years of my life on this. I really, really don't want to end here, because I've been so inspired going to these churches and talking to these people. And it was my son, who is a producer for a TV station in San Antonio. That's his day job. His real job, he'll tell you, is he's a drummer for a heavy metal band, Hell Knife. He said, well, Dad, you know they sang We Shall Overcome at the Berlin Wall. The Scorpions played it. The Scorpions apparently is a heavy metal band. And he said, yeah, they sung at other places. And I began looking, and the little rascal was right. Literally 6'5". It was sung on Tiananmen Square. Before the tanks came and mowed down 10,000 Chinese young people, they were singing We Shall Overcome. I got in a frenzy and began doing every database I could find, BBC, Al Jazeera, back records on found it. In fact, hundreds of places. People that were not Christian, not African American, and yet they were singing the exact same freedom songs that were sung during during the Civil War. We followed to the Arab Spring. I've got some extraordinary footage of people in Libya, Egypt, and Lebanon singing We Shall Overcome with King's picture, and We Shall Overcome, and ain't nobody gonna turn me around, and singing Oh Freedom in front of the army in Egypt. Over and over again. The Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong last year, sang it again. And then, perhaps you watched as I did as the funerals began on the Black Lives Matter, and kids who were way too young to know this stuff, 18 and under, marching in the protests, marching on the way to church, on the way to this graveside, singing these same songs. And then maybe you did, like I were, had friends at the women's marches in January, same songs were sung. I can't pretend to tell you I understand everything about that. I do know that these songs are something special, and that you ridicule them, or you ignore them, or you sing them lightheartedly at your own risk. If you're a politician and you're hearing people who have, for whatever reason, feel they have been denied justice, sing them, it's not something for you to blow off. These songs have been transformed and honed. They've been blasted away through the forge so that nothing remains but a melody that can be remembered, words that can be sung, and to sear a soul. And when I've heard them sung in black churches, now 50, 60, 70 years later, I feel the Holy Spirit in a way that I don't feel it in other places, that there is a power that has been endued in these songs. And it's part of why I think Randall asked me to speak to you is that there will be opportunities for you to sing gospel songs, you to sing spirituals in your churches. And just to remember that these are not ditties. These are not hymns written to make people happy. There is a history and a story in these songs. And we have spent a lot of time trying to track down every known recording of the Black Gospel Restoration Project to try to put together some kind of narrative related to it. One of the things I didn't know, for instance, is I started playing the different recorded versions of We Shall Overcome, all live, sometimes on a single handheld tape recorder, sometimes in the studio, from Montgomery right up until Memphis and Resurrection City. And the song transforms. It goes from being very labor union on the T for two white people beat kind of thing, kind of right to adding more and more stacks and volt Memphis sound, and becomes more magisterial, and all of these counter rhythms are going on, and people sing it now entirely different than they sang then. And it continues to evolve because it's part of the DNA that goes on. The Tibetan women's soccer team. You may remember in the last Women's World Cup, FIFA or FIFA, the soccer organization, World Soccer Organization, had their women's version of that, and countries had to play in. And in Tibet, they wanted to be a part of that, soccer being very big there. But in Tibet, controlled by China, the only place where that was allowed was in the refugee camps for the more than 1 million Tibetis that are in India, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, and the northern tier there. And they decided they were going to be the team to represent Tibet. And up in those terrible mountains, year-round playing in refugee camps where rape and hunger is rampant, sometimes playing in the snow barefoot, they put together a team that drilled ceaselessly, according to the BBC, which was there. Playing on a field that had a crazy 30-degree angle still full of rocks. They got somebody to donate a bus, and they went on a barnstorming tour of playing the national teams in all the countries they could reach: India, Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal. And they beat a lot of them. They beat a bunch of them. They beat enough of them to qualify as a team. So they made their formal application, got somebody to put the money, and on the day that they were to hear, China blocked their application. China saying Nepal is China. That's not a legitimate team. So after all of that, they didn't get to play after all. And the BBC was there that day. And the women, when they heard the news, didn't cry, didn't get angry, didn't throw things, didn't curse. They formed a big circle, and they sang "We Shall Overcome" in broken English. Got on their bus, kept singing, and I talked to the BBC reporter who was there. He kept his directional mic, and he followed them as they went up that hill into the snow, and they sang it until the mic could no longer repeat. Something happens. Something powerful is in this. And I feel blessed to be a part of saving and reproducing all of that. I want to play you one song all the way through. Of the many thousands, 11,000 now songs that we've received, this one came early by the Mighty Wonders of Aquasco, Maryland, a little fly speck in eastern Maryland. It's a custom project, like Elvis going in with $25, paying for his first 2 songs. They actually had Mark Custom Records, which is still in existence, come to their little church at Aquasco and record 2 songs. They paid for it, he gave them, they think, somewhere around 25 to 50 45s. A cappella, one take, and this was that song, one of the songs from that night.
Tis the old ship of Zion. Tis the old ship of Zion. Tis the old ship of Zion. Step on board if you want to see Jesus. Step on board if you want to see Jesus. Just step on board and follow me. There's nothing but love in God's water. Nothing but love in God's water. Nothing but love in God's water. Step on board if you want to see Jesus. Step on board if you want to see Jesus. Just step on board and follow me.
When our engineer finished playing that, I broke into tears. I didn't know why. And it's become something 9 years later, still kind of our theme song. We spent several years trying to track down anything we could on the Mighty Wonders. We went through census records. We made cold phone calls. We did everything possible, nothing. And I did an interview for NPR in Baltimore, and they covered it in the Baltimore Sun. They said, you know, that's in our readership zone. If somebody knows about this, they'll let us know. We'll put it on our website. So they put the song on. And lo and behold, several of the Mighty Wonders are still alive, in their mid-80s, still singing in Aquasca. So we back and forth and contacted, told them how much we love this music. We got permission to put the song on the disc you have. And when the National Museum of African American History and Culture asked me to provide songs, they asked for 1,000 songs to choose among, and then very quickly saw that was too many and asked us to narrow it down. So we sent about 500 albums and jackets and songs. And when we went up there in September, they had chosen 5 of them for the initial display where you can touch it and the speakers will fill the room. And there was Mahalia Jackson and Andre Crouch and the Ward Singers and the Mighty Wonders of Aquasca. Quite unbeknownst to them, that was the song that so mattered. So I called the guys, called Mr. Stewart, called his surviving daughter, Mr. Johnson, and others, and told them what had happened. And I said, isn't that just wonderful? And they said, yeah. He said, Mr. Darden, I don't know what your theology is. I don't even know if you're a Christian. He says, but in my tradition, we believe that there's a cloud of witnesses. And I believe that every time that song's played, the guys who are no longer with us, my friends, hear the song. And in that moment, more people have heard that song than ever heard it while we were alive. So I had said, don't you wish they could be here to hear the fact that it's in the museum, that it's being featured in the books? They're hearing it. And that's the way I feel about this music. It is being heard. It's being passed on way below the radar of most of us. But in the times that it needs to be there, it's there. Finally, Zora Neale Hurston, the great African-American writer during the Bronzeville and Harlem, wrote a story about, and it begins with the tale of King Arthur, going back to the oldest stories of King Arthur. And she said, if you read the old stories, not the stuff about Lancelot and all the romance, but the earliest ones, she says that Arthur doesn't die at the end, that in fact he's carried to a cave in Wales, and there he waits, and that he's waiting there still, and he will return at the time of England's greatest need. And she says, I believe that's the way of the spirituals, that they'll always be here. And then when African-American people, or as she had known what we know now, freedom-loving people, justice-searching people around the world, when they need these songs, they'll be there. They will come. Is that the Holy Spirit? Is that the High John the Conqueror? However that is disseminated, I don't know. I'm just an old reporter and a deacon in a Baptist church, but I do know something matters here. So all of that to say, if you would like to go to our site, you can listen to any of our songs. You can put in by name, you can put in by topic, you can put in by song title, you can put in by record label. And you can find what we have and listen to it. Streaming. Now you won't be able to download it obviously off this for copyright reasons. But you go in and put in your title up here, and lo and behold, it'll show up. Click on it, and see it, click on it, and hear it. Secondly, if you do want to hear some, we have spent way too much money, not my money, but way too much money, running copyright checks on about 30 of the songs, including Ocean Side and some others. And they're available for free downloads on iTunes U, which is iTunes' free site. And it has been since we put them up with the request that if you know anything about this song, or if you own it, or if your father wrote it, or mother was part of it, let us know, and we'll either take it down or we'll pay you the appropriate royalties for the number of times it's been downloaded. And unfortunately, in the 8 years these songs have been up, nobody's ever contacted us. We've set aside money in escrow for that. But it's also, these songs are the single most downloaded thing on iTunes U to this day, including some very famous TED Talks by other people. So, I would just ask that you take a brochure. If you know somebody that might have vinyl from the 1940s to 1970s, give them a copy. It tells them how to contact us. We'll pay for shipping, we'll pay for insurance. We'll give them back their vinyl if they want. We'll make MP3 so they can hear it without playing it on their turntable, which degrades it. If you know somebody you'd like more copies to take to a church, we'll be glad to send them to you. Just help us save this music for the reasons that I've just talked about, and we'll do whatever it takes to make it happen. So, thank you for coming.
I had no note that this project was going. Thank you so much.